People across the internet keep asking, why are black people so rare in Russia, a country of over 140 million? Anyone who's visited Russia or regularly watches content about it has probably noticed the same thing. In this nation of more than 140 million people, black residents are extremely rare. Even on the streets of Moscow or St. Petersburg, seeing a black face is uncommon. The contrast is even more striking. People of African descent make up over 8% of France's population, more than 7% in the UK, and over 3% in Germany. Russia, by contrast, has less than 0.03% of African descent, making it a unique case in Europe. Some even argue that while Russia never openly rejects people of African descent, its extremely strict immigration screening makes long-term settlement nearly impossible. To settle there, money and qualifications alone aren't enough. The screening process leaves almost no room for exceptions, making it a hotly debated issue in international migration. Many simply blame the situation on racism, accusing Russia of deliberately excluding outsiders, and the debate online remains fierce. But the reality isn't that simple. Russia's strict controls on African immigrants stem largely from problems and social scars left during the Soviet era. A little-known chapter of Cold War history is the real root of today's situation. Understanding it helps explain Russia's choices. The story begins in the 1960s, when the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union reached its peak and both superpowers competed for influence across Africa. The Soviet strategy was clear: build ties with newly independent African nations and train future pro-Soviet leaders who would support Moscow after returning home. To achieve this, the Soviet Union opened its doors and launched a large-scale scholarship program for African students. It also established Patrice Lumumba People's Friendship University in Moscow as the main institution for students from Asia, Africa, and Latin America, promoting Soviet ideology and training pro-Soviet elites. The university still operates today and continues its tradition of admitting students from developing countries. The program expanded rapidly. The number of African students grew from fewer than 1,000 in 1960 to more than 14,000 by 1979, accounting for 62% of all foreign students in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union became the world's largest destination for students from sub-Saharan Africa, far surpassing similar programs in the United States and France. The Soviet government devoted about 11% of its total education budget to the program, investing enormous resources in foreign education. To attract these students, the Soviet Union offered benefits far beyond those available to its own citizens, including fully paid round-trip airfare, free technical education, and a monthly stipend of 90 rubles. Students received the money without having to work. The Soviet Union hoped these generous benefits would strengthen its influence in Africa. But tensions and hidden problems began to emerge from the moment the students arrived in the Soviet Union. Over time, those differences grew into irreconcilable conflicts. The biggest source of resentment was the unequal treatment, which left many ordinary people feeling deeply frustrated. In everyday life, the contrast felt even more unfair. Almost anyone in that situation would have felt the same way. In reality, the Soviet Union was still recovering from the devastation of World War II. The country was rebuilding, ordinary people struggled to get by, and basic goods remained rationed. People often waited 2 hours in the freezing cold just to buy butter or sugar. Shortages were a fact of daily life, and everyone had to tighten their belts. A skilled Soviet worker earned only 50 to 60 rubles a month, while African students received a 90 ruble stipend. Local university students got just 15 to 20 rubles a month. The gap was enormous. In Moscow, a worker's monthly wage could buy nearly 400 kilograms of black bread, while an African student could buy almost 700 kilograms using the stipend alone. At the official exchange rate, 90 rubles equaled about $126, and its purchasing power exceeded that of many ordinary workers and even some mid-level Soviet officials. The issue wasn't just the numbers. Many Soviet citizens felt the system rewarded people who hadn't contributed, while those working hard for the country received far less. Complaints were everywhere, in factories, dormitories, and on the streets. One worker wrote in his diary, We sweat in the factories to build our country, while they do nothing and enjoy a life we can't even afford. That sentiment reflected how many people felt. Beyond the unequal benefits, differences in lifestyle only made tensions worse. Many Soviet students lived in cramped, overcrowded dormitories with more than a dozen people to a room, while some African students, supported by generous stipends, focused more on leisure than study. They wore fashionable Western suits, imported watches, listened to jazz, danced, spent time in parks and cinemas, and often dated young Soviet women. Today that might seem perfectly normal, but in the conservative, resource-starved Soviet Union, such scenes stood out and fueled resentment among many locals. The deeper issue was ideological. During Khrushchev's era, the Soviet Union strictly resisted Western cultural influence. Jazz, trendy fashion, and similar styles were labeled symbols of capitalist decadence. Even Soviet youth faced restrictions, so when African students openly embraced those lifestyles, many people saw it as crossing both social and ideological lines. Over time, everyday frictions escalated from arguments to small-scale clashes. According to Moscow police statistics from 1962 to 1963, reports of neighborhood disputes and street conflicts involving African students increased by 370%, far beyond ordinary social friction. Complaints ranged from noisy student parties to arguments with store clerks caused by cultural differences. Accidental bumps on the street often turned into arguments, sometimes even fistfights, and verbal abuse became increasingly common. These were isolated incidents, but as resentment grew, many people began blaming the entire African student community for the actions of a few. Prejudice spread across campuses and neighborhoods, and relations steadily deteriorated. The final spark came in the winter of 1963, when a mysterious death brought years of tension to a breaking point. A Ghanaian medical student, Edmond Serrato, was found dead outside Moscow. Soviet investigators concluded that he had frozen to death after becoming intoxicated. Many African students rejected that explanation, arguing he wasn't known to drink heavily and was unlikely to wander alone into the countryside on a freezing winter night. Authorities refused to let student representatives take part in the investigation. Rumors claimed there were bruises on his neck that were never mentioned in the official report. Others alleged he had been secretly dating a Soviet woman whose military family opposed the relationship, fueling speculation that his death was no accident. The already tense atmosphere finally exploded. More than 500 African students gathered and marched into Red Square, holding signs and chanting slogans. It became the Soviet Union's first large-scale protest by foreign students and quickly drew worldwide attention. Western media outlets, including Reuters, the Associated Press, and the BBC, gave the story prominent coverage, portraying it as evidence of racial discrimination and criticizing Soviet policy toward Africa. The incident damaged the Soviet Union's reputation in many developing countries and put Moscow on the defensive in the Cold War's battle for global opinion. According to this account, Khrushchev responded by tightening policies on African students, cutting stipends, requiring advance approval for travel, and ordering students to leave the country after graduation. African student admissions were also sharply reduced. By 1965, enrollment had reportedly fallen to fewer than 4,000, while admissions and background checks became much stricter. The account also claims that similar restrictions were not imposed on students from Eastern Europe or socialist countries in Asia, suggesting the new measures specifically targeted African students. Ironically, this costly diplomatic effort ended in failure, leaving the Soviet Union with both political and public relations setbacks. According to the narration, many African students had grown accustomed to the benefits they enjoyed in the Soviet Union and struggled to readjust after returning home. Instead of becoming pro-Soviet allies, some reportedly became disillusioned and criticized the Soviet Union. The narration claims that fewer than 3% eventually became pro-Soviet political leaders, far below the program's original expectations. The narrator argues that the program's failure led the Soviet Union to abandon large-scale recruitment of African students and adopt a long-term policy of tighter controls on foreign nationals. According to the narrator, this Cold War-era experience is an important historical reason for Russia's strict policies toward people of African descent today, though it is not presented as the only factor. The narrator says two deeper factors also help explain why black people remain so rare in Russia today. The first is Russia's lack of a colonial history in Africa. Unlike Britain and France, which ruled large African colonies for centuries, Russia never developed the same long-term migration networks. Former British and French colonies also share language and cultural ties with their former colonial powers, making migration to those countries far more natural. According to the narrator, the colonial system created lasting legal, linguistic, and economic ties between colonial powers and their colonies, making migration easier and cultural integration smoother. The narrator claims Britain and France brought millions of African workers to Europe during the colonial era. Over generations, second- and third-generation descendants became the majority of their black populations, creating large, established communities. The narrator argues this history makes Russia fundamentally different. Russia was never a primary destination for African migrants, largely because it lacked the same colonial migration networks as Britain and France. The second factor, according to the narrator, is that after the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Russia adopted much stricter immigration policies based on the late Soviet approach. The narration claims these policies, combined with lingering social memories from the Soviet era, resulted in an immigration system designed to preserve Russia's demographic structure, while imposing especially detailed reviews for some African applicants. According to the narrator, Russia's immigration policy prioritizes preventing large-scale migration that could lead to future ethnic tensions. The narration says that applicants for permanent residency must first hold temporary residency, prove a stable income, carry valid health insurance, pass a Russian language exam, and clear a criminal background check. It further claims that African applicants often undergo additional background reviews, including security checks, overseas connections, and assessments of their reasons for long-term residence. The narrator argues these extra reviews effectively raise the bar for permanent settlement and reduce approval rates. The narration cites figures claiming that Russia's population of African descent grew from about 30,000 in 2013 to roughly 41,000 by 2024, while only a small share reportedly held permanent residency. Against Russia's population of more than 140 million, that community remains very small. The narrator also points to language barriers, Russia's cold climate, and the long distance from Africa as additional obstacles. According to the narrator, these factors together mean relatively few Africans choose to move to Russia, and even fewer stay permanently. The narrator concludes that Russia's small black population cannot be explained by racism alone, but rather by three factors working together: history, migration policy, and geography. First, Russia had no colonial history in Africa, so it never developed the migration networks that connected many African countries with Britain and France. Second, the narrator argues that the Soviet African student program ended in failure, leaving lasting social tensions that influenced later immigration policy. Third, strict immigration rules, along with language, climate, and geographic barriers, continue to limit long-term settlement by African migrants. That raises an interesting question. What if the Soviet Union's African student program had succeeded? What if the Soviet Union's African student program had succeeded without any major conflicts? Would Russia today look more like Paris or London, where black communities are much larger? The narrator argues the answer is no. Citing a sociological theory of integration, the narration claims that when economic inequality, cultural differences, and ideological divisions all exist without effective institutions to bridge them, smooth integration is unlikely. According to the narrator, trying to force integration under those conditions only increases tension. The narration argues that successful integration requires three conditions: small economic gaps, strong cultural compatibility, and institutions that help different groups adapt to one another. The narrator concludes that the Soviet Union focused too heavily on Cold War diplomacy, while neglecting the concerns of its own population and failing to build mechanisms for integration. The narration therefore argues that Russia's current immigration policies reflect lessons drawn from that history rather than racism alone, while also noting that Russia's demographic makeup differs significantly from former colonial societies, such as Britain and France. According to the narrator, Russia's experience offers a case study in balancing immigration control and social integration, and helps explain the question raised at the beginning of the video. Thanks for watching today's episode of Defay Global Geography. If you enjoyed the video, please like, share, and subscribe. I'm Defay, and I'll see you in the next video.